My name is Thomas Plow, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all here tonight to this debate entitled God and Science. Underlying this title are questions concerning the possibility of uniting theistic beliefs with science, questions such as, can one do science with or without belief in a personal God? Or is science wholly incompatible with believing in the existence of a personal God? Representing an atheistic approach to these questions, to these issues, is Stinus Lindgreen. Stinus is chairman of the Danish Atheist Society. He holds a PhD in bioinformatics from Copenhagen University and is currently working as a postdoc researcher at the Center of Geogenetics, and he is working in the field of ancient DNA research. He lives in Lyngby, north of Copenhagen, with his wife and son. Please give a warm welcome to Stinus. To the far left, and representing a theistic approach in tonight's debate, is Vinoth Ramachandra. Vinoth is Secretary for Dialogue and Social Engagement in the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. He holds a PhD in Nuclear Engineering from Imperial College in London. He is a lecturer and writer, and in 2008 published the book Subverting Global Myth, Theology and the Public Issues That Shape Our World. Vinoth lives in Sri Lanka with his Danish wife. You're warm welcome. And just a few remarks on tonight's program. It has three items. Firstly, the debaters will each present their views on tonight's topic, and they are both given 8 minutes. Secondly, the debaters will also have the opportunity to respond to each other's presentation, and they have 5 minutes each for that. And then thirdly, we will move on to a discussion based on questions from you, the audience. So we hope that you have a lot of questions, and if you don't have it this time, then hopefully you will have that within half an hour's time. Well, and just a few ground rules for posing questions here. Firstly, please ask questions. Do not present your own worldview. We are not here tonight to listen to you, but to the two debaters. And please ask questions on tonight's topic. Please try to stay on topic and not off topic. And please ask as short questions as possible. And then, if possible, ask questions that may be addressed by both debaters. And then, finally, I strongly urge you to ask questions politely and respectfully. Yes, with these remarks, I shall now leave the floor to the first debater, Stinus Lindgreen.
Well, thank you. That's quite a nice turnout. So, well, if you have guessed, English is not my primary language, but I hope I can make myself understandable anyway. It sounds like this is on, so that's good. So, I have less than 10 minutes to present my worldview, which is going to be quite a challenge. So what I've decided to do is focus on a few key points that I think are relevant to tonight's discussion, that is science and religion. So briefly, I have 3 points I would like to address. One is that I do not claim that I can disprove the existence of gods. I only say that there are no good evidence, no good reasons to believe in any of the gods that you can believe in. And secondly, I say that the God hypothesis is at best irrelevant. And thirdly, I also say that you can still choose to believe in whatever God you want to and be a good scientist. So, to elaborate a bit on this, regarding the first point, as an atheist, what I say is simply that I don't believe in any gods. That is, any of the gods that you can imagine. This does not mean that I can prove that no gods exist, or that I know that they don't exist. No, it simply means that, given the evidence we have today, I see no good reasons to believe in any of the gods that you can believe in. So, keep in mind that I don't see any of the so-called holy books, whether that be the Bible or the Quran or something else, as anything different from any other book. It's written by humans and not inspired by any supernatural powers. This, of course, also means that if you want to argue for any sort of superstition, for instance, Christianity, you have to use other sources of arguments. So when you look at the history of religion and science, I think it's quite evident that as our scientific understanding of the world has progressed, we leave less and less room for gods. Thus, the gods that some people believe in are pushed further and further away. So once upon a time, we needed gods to explain everyday things like, why do we have lightning and thunder? Why does it become dark during the nighttime and all that? We don't need that anymore. Then at some point, we needed gods to explain why the planets orbited in a certain way. We don't need that anymore either. Then, of course, we needed gods to explain why we have so many different species and, of course, especially man. And we don't need that anymore either. And so the roles of gods have been diminishing steadily over the course of history. And today, I would say that we don't need the hypothesis, the God hypothesis, any longer to explain the world around us. Also, I think it's very important to point out that the burden of proof is on the people that make extraordinary claims. So this means that you're welcome to believe in whatever God you want to believe in, but don't expect me to join you unless you have good, solid evidence for your belief. So to illustrate what I mean by this, I could claim that at home, and this is an old rehashed image, but at home I have a pink invisible unicorn. So you can either choose to believe me or you can choose not to believe me. And it should be very evident to all of you that those two positions are not equal. You have every reason not to believe me. You don't have, if you're an invisible pink unicorn atheist, you don't have to prove me wrong. I have to prove to you that what I'm saying is true. And the same goes for all kinds of gods you could imagine. I also said that at best gods are irrelevant. And what I mean by this is that I know that God can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So for instance, you could believe in some all-encompassing spirit, some vague definition of a deistic God that perhaps started the universe and set everything in motion, decided on the constants, on the natural laws, and then never interacted with the world again. And that's fine. But I would say that that God is completely irrelevant. If your God does nothing, does not interact, then we could just as well explain everything with a naturalistic view of the universe. It doesn't make any difference. You cannot prove your God, and you could just as well disregard it without any consequences. You could also believe in a different type of God, and you could do that in many different ways. A God that more actively does something. For instance, raises people from the dead, or parts the Red Sea, and stuff like that. But that's a very different kind of God. And there it becomes interesting from our point of view, because even if we cannot test the God hypothesis as such, we can test the claims you make, because you're actually making claims about the natural world. So I think there are two different ways you can believe in gods. Well, to put it very simplistically, of course, you can have either this deistic, irrelevant vision of God, or a God that does something, and that could be to a greater or lesser extent, of course. So this also means that I do not buy into the notion of non-overlapping magisteria. That is the idea that religion and science are two distinct, non-overlapping areas. Because it seems to me quite evident that religions cannot accept this barrier in many regards, and that happens all the time. I'm not saying that all religious people do this, I just say that it happens in many cases. So if you believe in a deistic version of God, that's fine. But I still hope that that's an irrelevant belief. You could just as well believe in the universe without that God. If you believe in a more active God, that's also fine. You can believe in whatever you want to believe. But I will claim that you believe in that God in spite of the evidence and not because of the evidence. Finally, I also said that you can be a good scientist and still believe in God. And it would be quite silly to say otherwise, because, I mean, you could look at people like, say, Francis Collins, who's a believing Catholic and a great researcher. The important thing is that you follow the evidence. So that is why, for instance, Francis Collins accepts evolution, although he calls himself a theistic evolutionist, which I believe is also the term that Vinoth uses about himself. And So that means that he's able to hold on to his belief and still do good science. I still think, though, that the definition of theistic evolution is just as the deistic God kind of irrelevant. Because if what you're saying is that evolution is the way God decided to create all species, then you might as well say evolution is the natural way that species evolve. You don't need God. It's just an irrelevant hypothesis. On the other hand, if you also claim that, and it seems to me that most religions have this view, that humankind is somehow special. We're not just part of the animal kingdom, we are special in the eye of God. Then you're also saying that God did not just start evolution, he also decided a direction and a goal with it. And that, I think, is completely wrong. Evolution does not have a direction, does not have an end goal. If we could go back and restart evolution on, say, this Earth, I see no reason why we should expect to end up with the same species as we have today, and humans as being just another species by many others. I don't see why humans as we know them should be here. Good. And then finally, let me just say that I meet people at university who say they believe in some sort of God. So, I mean, that's another evidence that people can believe in something and still be good scientists. However, most of them fall into what I would call deistic people. Say they believe in something that is so vague that they might as well not believe in it and it wouldn't change anything. And also it seems that most of them haven't really considered what they believe in and what kind of consequences it actually has. But even so, if you are able to keep your religion separate from your scientific work, I have no problem with that. If you can keep it private, that's fine. You have to leave your beliefs at the lab door, so to speak. So we have to avoid mixing religion and science, just as we have to avoid mixing religion and politics. So if you're able to do that, if you're able to be a believer at home and a scientist at the university, that's fine with me. I personally don't understand how you can keep two such conflicting views in mind, but that's not my problem, that's the believer's problem, of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Stinus. Just as Stinus said, because the subject is so vast, I'll just focus on my worldview in relation to the practice of science. Actually, to practice science, to be a scientific researcher, one has to make certain assumptions, which I would say are fundamentally faith assumptions. First, we have to assume that there is a real world out there which is greater than my own mind and imagination, or even the collective minds and imaginations of the whole scientific community. So there is a real world, and it's an intelligible world. It's an ordered world. That's why our impulsive attitude to any phenomenon is to ask why. Why did this happen? Why does the apple fall to the ground? Why do the planets move in these elliptical orbits? You know, we are looking for reasons, and that presupposes that the world that we are living in, the world that we are investigating in, is an intelligible, ordered, structured world. Things are not just haphazard. Secondly, we assume that this order is not a necessary order, but what philosophers call a contingent order. In other words, the world does not have to be the way it actually is. There is no a priori, no logical reason why we should be, for example, living on the planet Earth with the solar system with only, say, 7 or 8 planets. We are still undecided as to how many planets there are. In other words, you don't find out the order, the nature of the universe by just sitting in your armchair and doing logical reasoning. You actually have to go out there and explore and find out what kind of world is this. In other words, you do experiments, you ask questions. It's a posture of basic humility before this world that is beyond our senses, beyond our imagination. And we believe that in some way, you know, we are investigating a reality that is given to us. That's not something that we deduce its functioning through mathematics and logic alone. The third assumption that we make is that we human beings, despite all our limitations, our finitude, our limited epistemic abilities, that we can still despite all this, discover that intelligible order. And when you think about it, we human beings, from a scientific point of view, are just a tiny speck of dust on a very average planet revolving around a very average-sized star in a galaxy that has 300 billion suns, in a universe that has maybe 1,000 billion galaxies like our own. And we have appeared on the scene relatively recently, very recently. When you look at the time scale of the whole universe, 13.7 billion years is the best estimate. So why is it that we believe that we are tiny specks of dust in this remote corner of the universe can actually unlock the patterns, the structures, the fabric of reality? That's an enormous leap of faith. So when you take all these three assumptions together, you realize that science is ultimately an enterprise of faith. When you ask the bigger questions, why is science possible? Why does science work at all? Why there is a universe that we can explore, then we are going beyond science into the whole realm of philosophy and theology. Now, for a Christian theist, the scientific enterprise makes perfect sense. It is because we human beings are made in the image of God, so our human rationality, just like the rationality of the universe, are both ultimately grounded in the rationality and faithfulness of the Creator. And that is what makes science a meaningful, worthwhile enterprise. And that is why when you look at the history of experimental modern science, it had deep Christian roots. Many historians of science will tell you that the Protestant Reformation had a powerful impact on the rise of experimental science because it liberated people from sort of the Greco, particularly the Plato-Aristotelian view that saw creation either as an emanation of some impersonal deity, and if it's an emanation, then you don't explore something that is divine in itself. But when you say that this is a creation, it is distinct from the Creator, and yet it has its own rationality that we have to explore, and we have to exercise responsible stewardship over this order because that's God's command to us, then we have powerful reasons to do scientific research. That is why Charles Darwin, in his preface to The Origin of Species, actually quotes those famous words of Francis Bacon from the 15th century, where Bacon wrote, "God has written two books which he calls us to explore, the book of Scripture, through which we discover the nature and the will of God, and there is the work of nature, which demonstrate God's works, which we are also called to explore." In other words, we don't come to know God by studying nature, but having come to know God through the study of Scripture, we see his hand in everything around us. He is the one who sustains and gives meaning and purpose to this creation. Similarly, if you go to the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge University, one of the most famous physics laboratories where many of the breakthroughs in 20th century physics were made, inscribed over the doors of the Cavendish Laboratory are the words from Psalm 111. "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who take delight in them." So the Christian faith has been a very powerful motivation for the study of science. So I agree with Stinus, you don't have to be a Christian to do good science. But if you start asking the bigger questions about science, then you need a bigger worldview than what a secularist, atheist, or naturalist worldview can offer, because science itself cries out for explanation. So science and theology are actually cousins. We are both involved in exploring reality, but from different perspectives. And I agree with him that the separate magisteria that Stephen Jay Gould and others spoke of don't really apply. Because science helps us in developing our theology and understanding more in detail what does God's creative work look like, but theology also poses questions to science, and very interestingly, we are discovering today a lot of overlaps. Scientists are beginning to discover that the origin of life on the earth was no mere accident, but it seems that even from the time of the Big Bang, there were certain constraints on the laws of the universe that made possible the emergence of intelligent life in some part of the universe. So there are these constraints. Simon Conway Morris at Cambridge University and many others talk of evolutionary convergence. In other words, evolution itself is not just purely a random chance process, but there are certain organizing principles which we don't yet understand today that constrain the direction in which evolution has gone. So if you were to rewind the tape of life and go back and start all over again, you will most probably come to the same set of diverse life forms that we have today, because there are ways in which different organs develop, which are determined not only by random mutation and selection, but certain other constraining principles which we are beginning to explore today. So thank you.
Thank you. So Stinus, you have 5 minutes to respond.
Yep. Thank you. So to start from the end, I didn't say that evolution was purely random. Of course not. There are many things that are non-random in evolution, we know that. And I wouldn't expect life to be completely different. I just say that the species we have today, I see no reason why we should have that specific set of species if we rewound the tape of time. But anyway, it's a question none of us can really answer at any point anyway. But you touch upon a few things. I agree with you on many of the things like the age of the universe and the size of the universe, the number of galaxies and all that. And one thing I think is interesting is that my conclusion from looking at that is that it seems a bit, I don't know, self-centered from a human kind of perspective to say that everything, all the billions of galaxies, as you talk about, all the billions and billions of possible solar systems were created for us, this single little species that have been here for like maybe 200,000 years, depending on the definition of human, out of 13.7 billion years. I mean, it's such a small fraction of the entire time that it seems to me a bit ludicrous to argue that it's because of us. And also you say that because we have an orderly universe that we're able to investigate using our rational brains and all that, it's evidence of some sort of creator. I don't see that argument at all. It's kind of like the anthropic principle argument. So I have a hard time imagining any kind of stable universe where the laws of nature were haphazard, as you put it. I don't see how that could ever exist for any long enough period of time for life to evolve anyway. So if that kind of universe could exist, it probably would exist for a very short period of time and not really give rise to life. But in any case, we can see, the only thing we can observe is that the kind of universe we are living in obviously supports life, at least on this one planet out of billions and billions of possible planets. And the laws of nature in a specific way that allows life. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here to observe it. But that doesn't mean that the laws were designed to fit us. More likely that we evolved to fit the laws of nature. And I don't see why you couldn't imagine a great number of possible universes with other laws that could support some other sort of life. Maybe it's not possible, I don't know, but even that you can imagine other universes with other sets of laws makes it become void to say that the laws of this universe are specifically tailored for us. Because you might just as well argue that there are a number of possible universes that either have existed or exists in parallel to us, and that's just as plausible, even more so, I would say, argument than saying that because of the laws of nature we have, there must be some sort of creator God that put it all in motion. You also say that at some point we reach questions like, how did the universe begin? And at that point you have to jump to theology and philosophy to answer that, if I understood you correctly. And I don't think that's right. I think the only, if we can answer that question in any meaningful way, it's going to happen in cosmology, from science. It's not going to happen from theology or from philosophy, because they don't investigate the world out there. It's a completely separate field. And when I'm talking about an overlap between the two fields of science and religion, I don't mean that in a positive way, I should state. I think it's a bad thing when religion tries to move into the arena of science, and I think that should be avoided. And also, I don't at all disagree with the historical roots of of science. Obviously, many of the old great scientists have been believers, but then again, everybody at that time more or less believed because that's what you did. So it's not a big surprise, I would say. And still, the discoveries they made, the good ones, I mean, even Newton made some pretty weird scientific research, if I can call it that. So even, now I got a bit confused. So anyway, the historical roots, obviously it was many of the great scientists of old were Christians, but that doesn't mean that Christianity was the foundation of science, but just means that most people were Christians back then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let me correct some of the misunderstandings or misrepresentations of what I said, and I'll go backwards. Beginning with your last point, I didn't say that one had to be a Christian to be a science, or that every early scientist was a Christian. I was speaking about the dominant culture that shaped the rise of science. So even if individuals, and there were atheists, remember, and deists who were not Christian theists, doing science, but the dominant culture shaped by the Protestant Reformation was conducive to the rise of experimental science, because it liberated much of university scholastic thinking from Aristotelian and Platonic ways of thought. There was a book published last year, the Cambridge Companion to Science and Religion, which is a very good handbook that I would recommend. Several essays on the history of science and the philosophy of science. So if you want a very good introduction to these issues, I would recommend that book, the Cambridge Companion to Science and Religion, published by Cambridge University Press, 2010. Then going backwards, about origins, I don't think I said that philosophy and theology comes in only when you're looking at the origins of the universe. When we speak of origins, we have to distinguish between two kinds of origins. There are chronological origins, what was the first event from which other events flowed by cause and effect processes. And then there is the question of ontological origins. What is the source, the ultimate ground of existence? Now, Christian belief in creation is about ontological origins, not about chronological origins. It doesn't say that God was involved only in the Big Bang or the event prior which caused the Big Bang or whatever, or at the beginning of the evolutionary process. God has brought into being a creation which has a potentiality to make itself, and yet God is the one who sustains the whole process. If God is God, then God is behind the whole show and not just at the beginning. So we have to distinguish between chronological origins and ontological origins. And so God's existence is not like whether the pink unicorn exists in the universe, because God strictly does not exist. All existence is in God. That's the language we should use. If God is God, then the universe exists in God. God does not exist as another being in the universe. Then about parallel universes, other universes, again, remember that that is not science. That is speculation. Because if there were other universes in which there were other life forms or whatever, there is no way that those other universes communicate with us. And so this is a realm of philosophical speculation. So I find it quite strange that we can entertain that kind of philosophical speculation. But the moment we say actually belief in God, which doesn't come from science, which comes from elsewhere, and yet belief in God helps us to make sense of the anthropic principle, helps us to make sense of evolution and cosmic unfolding and so on, helps us to make sense of human life as we experience it. Why is that argument then ruled out of court? And you say we must not bring that into the laboratory, but we can speculate about parallel universes. That is not scientific either. I didn't say that galaxies and the universe was created for us human beings. It is God, the Creator, who delights in bringing into being a creation, something that He can love unconditionally. But I said that human beings do have a special role to play in this universe, because we, alone of all the creatures that have come into being, share something of the rationality of God and are responsible to God for what we do with this planet, which is our home. And my argument was that, okay, if you rule out this wider theistic perspective and you say that we human beings are here by an impersonal, accidental process, we are just like a blip on the cosmic screen, an afterthought, froth that comes to the surface of the ocean, where on earth did we get this idea that we can unlock the secrets of the universe? We can discover the truth about the reality. Like I said, that's an enormous leap of faith, and it's a leap of faith that cannot be justified within this atheistic way of looking at life.
Thank you. It's time now for questions, and I'm certain that you are all loaded with questions now. And we have a microphone over there, so if you have a question, then please go to the microphone and ask it.
Yes, my name is Jasper Carlsen. I'm a senior research fellow at the Humboldt University in Berlin. To Stinus, to me it sounds as if you have never read Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus.
That's correct.
Well, go and read it then. Point 2 is, where do the laws of nature come from? And point 3, you say we should not mix together religion and science. I fully agree with that. But to the best I can hear, it's you that is doing that. You are creating some nonsense, and then you argue against this nonsense. See, this is nonsense, haha. and that's not really a proper way of arguing.
So point 2 was a question at least. So you're asking where did the laws of nature come from? I would say that I don't know, and I don't have to know. I mean, I'm not arguing, I'm not saying that I can explain everything in the world. I'm just saying that we can explain as much as we can using science, and you're welcome to believe in whatever other explanations you want to, but as long as it's just belief, I don't have to accept that. And obviously we need to have some laws of nature for a universe to exist. And for instance, if you read the latest book by Stephen Hawking, there he tries to explain at least a theory of how universes can come into existence, which also touches upon why the theory of having multiple universes is not just the same as religion, because you can actually make a model that would predict this sort of things happening. But I agree, it's completely speculative at the moment, so it's just a theory at best. But anyway, you need to have some laws of nature, you need to have some constants in nature for a universe to exist, and these seem to be immanent in how universes seem to come into existence. You need to have some laws to begin with anyway, so it's not surprising to me that we're going to find laws that support life, because we are here. So if they were not like that, we wouldn't be here to investigate them anyway. And the last point, I apologize if I mischaracterized your views. That was not that's not my goal at all. So please correct me if I said anything that you did not mean.
Comments?
Yeah, well, the only experience of laws that we have are laws that are created by personal conscious agents. And that's why some atheistic philosophers of science prefer not to use the language of laws of nature, because it implies that there is a lawgiver, and they would like to describe maybe the order, the structures, the patterns, without using the language of law. You keep mentioning people like Hawkins and those who actually subscribe to what I would call a God of the gaps. The God of the gaps is the God who comes in when you have no scientific explanation. You cannot explain something, so you bring God in. Then if you have explained it satisfactorily with a scientific theory, that God gets chucked out of the window. Now Hawkins and Dawkins and all these popular writers actually are arguing against a God of the gaps. So their arguments are irrelevant to a mature Christian theology. Yes, there may be people in our churches that believe in a God of the gaps, but you shouldn't be wasting your time arguing with them. You should argue with with the concept of God that is articulated in Christian theology for the last 2,000 years, and that is not the God of the gaps. You know, God is not an alternative to a scientific explanation. For example, if I were to go home and say boil some water to make a pot of coffee, and the pot of coffee is boiling, and you ask me, why is the pot of coffee boiling? And I say to you from a physics level, I say, look, the vapor pressure equals the atmospheric pressure. That's equal. That's a complete answer. There is no gap in that account. Or I can talk in terms of the kinetic energy of the molecules and the phase transition that is taking place. We know that physics pretty well. There are no gaps there. But if somebody who doesn't know physics comes and says, well, that pot of coffee is boiling because Vinoth is making a pot of coffee, you know, that is true at a higher level of meaning. You know, so the question, why does something happen, can be answered at many different levels. Science answers the why questions in terms of cause and effect. Religion or theology answers the why questions in terms of reasons. And reasons imply conscious personal agents who give reasons for their actions. That's where the language of purpose comes in. So why I say that the story that talks of Vinoth making a pot of coffee is a higher level explanation is because it does not cancel the lower level. If the vapor pressure didn't equal the atmospheric pressure, it wouldn't be boiling. It assumes that that account is true. There's no problem with that. We accept that. But because that kettle is boiling in the wider context of personal agents engaging with each other, one of whom is making a pot of coffee for himself and for others, that we bring in the notion of purpose and reasons. So the higher order explanation embodies the lower order explanation, but goes beyond it. So the theological account of creation is like that. It is not at the same level as an evolutionary or a cosmological account of origins and of the universe. It assumes that that level is true. But it says God's creation is embodied in those evolutionary mechanisms and processes that bring about the diversity of biological life. So we as human persons are embodied in anatomical, physical, biochemical structures, but we are more than the structures in which we are embodied. There is a dimension to us that transcends the physical, material, natural realm. And that is what we mean when we say we are persons and not things or objects that science investigates.
Yeah, well, I would say that just because we use a word like law to describe the laws of nature, it doesn't imply that there has to be a lawgiver. It's just the words we have to use. And
yes, I agree, and I don't make a big issue out of
okay,
it. I wouldn't press it.
Okay.
But I'm saying there are some who are uncomfortable with the language of law because it seems to imply a theistic. Yeah.
Sure, but even so, say we can agree that we have a law and a universe with orderly laws. Even if that's the case, why then should Christianity and your specific understanding of Christianity then be true? Why not some other religion? Why not another belief? What is it that makes Christianity any more special than any other weird belief people could have about the universe?
Well, I didn't make any special claim for Christianity in this regard. And I'm not saying that I'm a Christian because I look at the world and deduce that the world makes sense only in relation to the God of Christian belief, which is a Trinitarian God. Mm-hmm. The belief in God as relational, which is what the Trinity amounts to, comes out of the historical events to do with the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And it is because of my conviction about those events that I'm a Christian, but having come to know that God is like Jesus, I begin to see that same pattern of self-giving love, of relationality, written throughout the cosmos. I see it in the quantum world, for example, where there is a profound relatedness and interconnectedness to all things. I see it in evolution as more and more systems biologists, and you know more about this than I do, talk about the remarkable cooperation that involves, cells and genes and all this, the 10 to the power 13 connections in our brain. That for life to get going and life to be sustaining, there is a remarkable cooperative activity that goes on at different levels. And I see these as reflections on the lower order of that ultimate self-giving relationality, which we as Christians call the Trinity.
Well, when I look at life, I agree it's pretty complicated. But I see complication on a level that, to me, does not scream designed by any creator, but more bottom-up design, where we have to use whatever is available to try and fix the problems we created in an earlier stage. So when I look at how life functions, it's too complicated to be designed by any good designer anyway. So I don't see the argument from design or the argument from an ordered universe as convincing in any way at all.
Yes, but I think you're putting words into my mouth. I never use words like design and designer because the Bible never uses those words, and Christians don't. Those are very impersonal ways of understanding God. God is not primarily an engineer. God is primarily a lover, and a lover is involved in relationships. And so I'm speaking about the relationality that is built into the universe, which itself comes out of God's love, that God wants to share his love with something that is not God, something other than God, a creation that is us, that is the trees, the rainforests, the animals, all of us. The fundamental distinction between God and the rest of us is the distinction between the Creator, who is self-sufficient, and we who are dependent. And yet the Creator, in his love for us, gives us being, gives us existence, and invites us to participate in his love, in exploring both his own character and the kind of world he has made. Now, that goes well beyond this language of engineering and design and law and so on.
All right, I think we should move on. But thank you. Next question.
Hi there. There's so many questions, I don't know where to start. I'm Bo Westergaard, I'm just a doctor. I know we are known for being shoddy scientists. But even so, to the gentleman on the right, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce your name. You start out with 3 assumptions, and I'm wondering where you got those assumptions, because I'm not completely sure that a lot of scientists would actually agree with those. First one is that we assume that there is a real world out there and it's ordered. And I mean, you say we take that on faith. I'd rather say that that is a necessary assumption. If you don't have that assumption, then it's impossible to make any meaningful claims about the world. So it's not really a faith issue. It's a necessary assumption you have to make to even get started. And the third assumption you make, that scientists assume that they can unlock the secrets of the universe. I say that's not really an assumption. I mean, it's basic to the empirical method that you can never know when you reach any kind of finite knowledge. Rather, I think most scientists 100 years ago would be surprised at how far we've come. So where did you get those assumptions?
Well, 9 out of 10 scientists never reflect on the work that they're doing. They would do science because science is just a career like every other career, and in many cases it carries more prestige, social prestige than other disciplines. People do science for all sorts of reasons, and the very success of science is why science enjoys such a privileged position in many parts of the world. But the philosophically minded scientists, and there are very few of them, are the ones who reflect on these deeper questions. Why is science possible at all? What kind of world is this that makes science possible? And what is it about us human beings as scientists that actually makes science work? So that's what I meant by assumptions. And when you go into the history of science, as well as the philosophy of science, you find that these are questions that take you beyond science as narrowly practiced. In other words, you are getting into philosophical and theological territory. That first assumption is not taken for granted in many cultures of the world. There are many cultures where it's believed that the physical sensory world is really illusory. It is mind, it is consciousness that is real. And all that we call physical and material is somehow at a lower level of reality. And if you want truth, you don't do physical manual labor, studying rocks and stones and plants. You turn inwards, you meditate, you contemplate, because that is where you find the highest truth. So modern experimental science could never have arisen in a culture which had that, what we call, idealistic view of the world. There has to be a kind of a realist understanding of the world for science to get off the ground. Very interestingly, even Stephen Hawking, in his recent writings, he says he's not a realist, he's a positivist. He doesn't believe that science has anything to do with truth. Science is just beautiful mathematical models. It's games we are playing, because he has really given up on truth. And I'm saying that it's Jews and Christians and Muslims who have very powerful arguments for saying, no, science is about truth, because there is a real ordered world out there, and we human beings are not just mere accidents in some remote, obscure part of this enormous universe who just happen to exist, but actually we reflect the Creator's mind in some finite but real way. And that therefore, by exploring this world as God's handiwork, we can come to understand something of the mind of the Creator. That was my argument.
Stinus, do you have a comment?
Yeah, well, I can see that in many of the discussions we've had, that we come from at this from very different perspectives. I mean, many of the things you say, because I don't think that way, it doesn't mean anything to me when you talk about a loving Creator and how you see the what did you call it, the image of God when you look at systems biology and all that. It doesn't really connect with me at all. What I see when I look at nature is intrinsically beautiful and extremely interesting to spend my time on. And to answer the gentleman here, I think that when we are able to do this, when we're able to perform science and look at nature and understand this and have an interest in doing so, I see that as an evolutionary byproduct of our brain's development. We have brains that have a specific wiring that makes these things emerge. So we are interested in looking at things and understanding things. And you also mentioned again that we're living in a rational universe with laws that we can actually investigate. And I agree, but as I also said earlier, I have a hard time imagining any other kind of universe where humans or any kind of life could be. So I don't see that as an argument in any case.
Well, I don't think evolution gives a satisfactory explanation, because, I mean, all you need to survive on the planet Earth is a simple knowledge of mechanics or dynamics, Euclidean geometry, arithmetic. You don't need knowledge of Hilbert spaces and gauge fields and string theory and these elaborate methods. And yet that's what we human beings are creating, inventing, doing, and we find that these equations and models and formula that we come up with somehow fit the universe.
In some cases.
Now, yes, and there are people who will say, there are mathematical physicists, Paul Dirac, the most famous, who said, if our equations are beautiful and simple, then even if the evidence seems to go against what our equations predict, we should trust our equations. And in most cases, they have been vindicated, that the evidence has come later. But the scientists have chosen to trust the simplicity, the elegance, the beauty of their models, because there is an intuitive feeling, the world is orderly, intelligible. And therefore there are these elegant patterns and structures which we can trust. Now, the very act of trusting our reasoning has to be vindicated. Now, I don't think an evolutionary account of human reason actually does that, because human reason goes beyond the biological origins of the human brain.
That's why I said it was a byproduct of the brain. It's not like we evolved that to be able to reason. I think it's just a good reason.
Why do you trust your reason? Why do I trust my reason if these are just accidental byproducts?
But why not? I mean, even if, say, love is a byproduct of the brain, why shouldn't I trust that I love somebody? It's just, I think it's a meaningless question.
But if somebody does not love, somebody hates, somebody kills others, that's equally a byproduct. Why do we say this byproduct is more valuable than that other byproduct, unless we have a bigger framework of meaning?
That seems pretty obvious to me.
With which we evaluate those byproducts.
Some of these byproducts, to keep in that term, have pretty drastic effects on the society we live in. So obviously we have to say that it's not equally good to go around killing people and loving people. For obvious reasons, I think they're not.
No, I think you're presupposing a lot there. I mean, I didn't mention the moral values that also are embedded in scientific practice. We take it for granted that telling the truth is basic, fundamental, that when we discover something, we publish it, we are transparent. Whenever there is fraud and cheating in the scientific community, we are shocked. We believe in teamwork, in patience. There are so many moral values that we assume to be universal and objective, and without which science just couldn't get off the ground. So, again, we are faced with the question, what is the source of these values? And they don't come just from the evolutionary process.
Well, we don't agree there, again, because I think there are obvious evolutionary advantages to having a society where you expect other people to not lie to you, to not cheat, that we're able to work together in a society. It makes complete sense to me that would give a great advantage to any species, any social species.
Well, it's an assumption. There are many evolutionary psychologists who are anti-religious, who say that religion is also a very powerful adaptive strategy. It works from an evolutionary perspective, but it is not true. So obviously there is another notion of truth that is being invoked here, other than adaptive strategy, evolutionary success.
So did you say that religion is not a good adaptive strategy?
That evolution is. Michael Ruse, for example, he argues that religion is a successful adaptive strategy. Mm-hmm. That's why it has survived for so long, but that it's not true.
Why is it not true?
Yeah, because he believes it's not true, that you cannot believe the claims of religious traditions and religious communities.
Okay, so you say that religion is not...
So that it's possible to argue that something is evolutionary successful, and yet it is not true. It is based on a lie or illusion, make-believe or whatever. So now, if you argue like that, and clearly you also assume that religion is not... then you're invoking a notion of truth other than that of evolutionary success, other than that of successful adaptation. And that's what we're doing all the time, not only in science, but in any intellectual enterprise. We recognize that truth cannot be just a byproduct of nature or a social construction. It comes to us from outside of ourselves. It compels us, it persuades us. Truth forces us to change and to follow it. Otherwise, we are left imprisoned within our own natures or our own cultural value systems.
Well, I'm just saying that I don't see any conflict still. I mean, I have no problem thinking that religion could have given advantage to a group. I mean, there are many things that religion can do for a group without that necessarily being true. I mean, you can see different religions being created all over the world at different times, each of them having a purpose in the community where they are created. That doesn't mean that they are true. I mean, obviously, all of them cannot be true.
Yeah, exactly, but that's what I said. That's the argument of people like Michael Ruse, who is not a Christian, who is arguing against religion, but saying religion is a successful adaptive strategy. And there are people who argue the same, like you said earlier, about truth-telling and moral values and so on. But you're then still left with the question, then on what basis do you say that this is not true? If you said that truth is measured by evolutionary success.
I didn't say that. I mean, that something is successful doesn't mean that it doesn't really make any sense. I mean,
Let me rephrase that. that if you're saying that truth is not based on evolutionary success, okay, and something that is evolutionary successful is yet untrue, then what notion of truth are you invoking?
I still don't, maybe it's just because I'm not a theist. I don't really understand the problem at all. I mean, I can see why an idea can spread in a group without that idea necessarily being true. And still you could imagine having in the same group, a pressure for having that people do not lie to each other. But if you don't know that what you believe is untrue, then it's not really lying. If you're spreading what is, I mean, this is going to be a bit weird. I don't.
No, because you
really
began by saying that telling the truth and all these other moral values were necessary for the survival of society.
No, I say it's not necessarily necessary. I just say I can see a huge advantage in you assuming that your co-humans do not lie to you, do not kill you, do not steal from you. All that I can see great advantages.
There are people, I mean, we praise them, the great martyrs who have stood up for what they believe is true against society and who have suffered. They have not, they have been willing to stand against society for the sake of a supra-social truth. And so there are many moral stances that we take which are not necessarily socially cohesive, which don't contribute in any way towards social cooperation or functioning. So where then do these convictions about ultimate truth and justice and so on come from? They cannot just come from the evolutionary process, which I'm not denying. I'm denying their self-sufficiency. Just as gravitation affects everything in the universe, evolution also affects everything on the planet Earth. But gravitation is not everything. It doesn't tell us the whole story about physical matter. And evolution does not tell us the whole story about human life.
No, obviously not. I mean, we are complex animals living in complex societies with complex relationships. So it's not like we can reduce everything to being evolutionary biology. I'm not saying that at all.
All right, I think it's time to move on to the next question.
Hello. You said earlier, way in the beginning, that Vinoth, I'm talking to, that science and theology were cousins and examined the world, both of them. My question basically is, can theology actually demonstrate the existence of its normal field of study? Because when you told the story of Vinoth makes a cup of coffee, we know that it's a fair explanation that the water's boiling because you put it over because you want a cup of coffee. We know that because you exist. We can see you. You're here.
Yes.
We know you can actually make a cup of coffee. Until you can demonstrate that God actually exists, I don't think it's fair to use God as an explanation for why something is, saying God did so-and-so or wants so-and-so, if you understand what I mean.
Yes. Well, there are many things that scientists explore that they cannot demonstrate at all in the laboratory. The existence of quarks, for example, the fundamental building blocks of atoms. Confined quarks have never been observed. And yet we need that theory of confined quarks, or what's called quantum chromodynamics, to explain, to account for other behaviors. So there are many things that we don't directly observe, which we can never directly demonstrate, but which actually help us to make sense of so much else. Now, belief in God is like that. If God were God, you cannot demonstrate him like any other object in the universe. And I've said that before. If God could be explored in the laboratory, that's not God. That is something less than us human beings. C.S. Lewis, writer of the last century, once said, I believe in the sun, not because I see the sun so much directly, but through the light of the sun, I see everything else. We don't look directly at the sun, we are blinded by it. But the light of the sun is what enables us to make sense of every other thing. And tonight we've been exploring the whole nature of science. And I've been saying it is in the light of that knowledge of God, which comes from certain acts in history through which Christians believe that God has made himself known. It is through that we then begin to look at science, and science actually becomes a meaningful human enterprise. A meaning that it would lack, I believe, within any other comparable perspective. So, what is the fundamental claim of the Christian faith? It is that a man who hung on a cross outside the walls of Jerusalem is what God is truly like. Now, that's a absurd, a foolish message. If you think about what crucifixion meant in the ancient world, no Roman citizen could be crucified. It was a worst form of execution. It was a form of execution that was meted out to rebellious slaves and people that we today would call terrorists. And just imagine a group of people going around the world claiming that among those crucified nobodies, the scum, the rubbish, the subhuman of the earth, there was one who was no less than the God in human flesh, God in human personhood. It's such an absurd, such a counterintuitive claim. The Christians didn't gain anything by claiming that. A lot of them were imprisoned, many of them were martyred for claiming that. It is because it was such a foolish message, it gets under my skin. It has a ring of truth about it. It forces me to go and explore. What was it about this man? What was it about his crucifixion? What was it about what happened after his crucifixion that gave rise to what we call the Christian movement, the Christian church? Now, as you begin to explore those questions scientifically, using the tools of historical research, then again you come not to demonstrate the truth of this. You can't demonstrate these fundamental things, but they become plausible. You begin to see your life, you begin to see the world in a very different perspective. And that's the way that people are converted from one particular worldview to another. So I would invite you to explore the claims that were made for Jesus of Nazareth and why those people made such claims, and explore them with the same curiosity, the same scientific rigor that you would do claims about, any other phenomena in the natural world, and then see where that leads.
Well, at least we agree that that story is absurd. But apart from that, I would say to what you asked, I think there's a huge difference here, because of course we can talk about things that we cannot directly observe in the lab, but we can measure the effects, we can make predictions, we can see whether that holds up to scrutiny, whether what we would expect to see actually happens in the lab. We can revise our theories based on that. That's what we're doing all the time. That's what they're doing in the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider. So, I mean, this is science. Whereas God, if you say, as you explained, that you cannot measure him, because if you could do that in the lab, he wouldn't be God, he would be less than human, right? That's more or less what you said. But we can still measure, as I also said earlier, even if you, and I think we agree that if such a God did exist, we wouldn't necessarily be able to prove that in any meaningful way, but the effects that God would have on the universe, on our life, on the world, would be measurable. If he does something that interacts with us, that counters what we normally understand as a natural order of things, then we can measure that effect.
Yes, but I was trying to raise from the beginning the bigger questions. On one level, it's very simple to explore the things that the Super Hadron Collider is investigating, because those don't affect me. I mean, whether the Higgs boson exists or not doesn't affect me at all, But whether God exists or not affects me at a very fundamental level. It changes the whole direction of my life. So our prior inclinations, the openness of our wills, our willingness to submit one's life to another, all these shape the process by which we explore those questions of theology. That doesn't shape the way that we explore questions of fundamental physics. So if you really want to understand the world, like I said, there are many different levels of complexity. The most fundamental is the physics level. But in many ways, that's also the most irrelevant, because it doesn't affect me as a human being. But as we go into areas of psychology and sociology and history and deal with more and more of the complexity of what it means to be human persons and to be a human society, then you find that this kind of laboratory demonstration and making experimental predictions simply is inapplicable.
Yeah, but I
that
think
understanding is different from explaining things in terms of cause and effect.
yeah, but I think the point of the question was that it's comparing. I mean, you can talk about things that you cannot observe directly and still measure the effects of that. And he was asking about theology and whether you could define that field without having some.
Well,
sort of
I can't demonstrate to you, say that my wife loves me or that I love my wife. What are the experimental indicators? I can say with 100% conviction, I love my wife and I know she loves me.
yeah,
But
I
how do
can
we?
see
What
that your
are
wife
the what are
exists
the
at least.
predictions? What are the sets of behavior that you would define that would demonstrate universally to people of all cultures that there is a real relationship of love between my wife and I?
Well, I see no point in belief in doing that, but at least I can see that your wife exists. I can see that you exist. I can see that you arrive together. So it's fair to assume that you probably
Yeah,
love
because
each
she's
other.
a finite human being like me.
Yeah.
But when we speak of
So-
God, we are not speaking of a
No.
finite being. That is the God of the gaps that you are
Mhm.
insisting
No.
on demolishing.
No,
I'm
that was not
speaking of if God is beyond the universe and we all exist. And even now, as I'm speaking to you, and all these neurons are firing in my brain, everything is held in being by one who, if he withdraws himself from us, I cease to exist. Now, how can I speak of that one in the same way that I speak of my wife, let alone how I speak of this cup of water and the molecules of water? You know, it's different language. It's a whole different discourse. And you cannot apply standards taken from physics or biology and apply them to that level of discourse. All we can say is all of us are exploring the nature of reality, but reality is hierarchically structured. It exists in complex patterns at different levels. The physicist explores reality at one particular level, so does the biologist. And theology is a science that seeks to integrate all these different disciplines into a coherent whole.
I think it's time to move on.
Hi. There are certain religious groups who would take the Bible literally and say the earth is several thousand years old, that the flood of Noah literally happened. So my question is that when you have religious ideas that are directly contradicted by the scientific evidence, how do you reconcile that? I mean, would such a religious person, would you consider them to be correct or incorrect? I mean, many of the arguments tonight have been at a higher level, really consistent with the scientific evidence. But in a case like that, what would be your response?
Well, you see, long before the theory of evolution came up in the 19th century, I mean, Augustine in the 4th century was arguing that the days of creation in Genesis chapter 1 are not to be taken literally. These are long eons of time. And he argued on hermeneutical grounds that there are clues within the text itself that tell us in what way we should interpret this. That this is not written like a journalist describing what happened on the streets of Copenhagen yesterday. This is more like a poet trying to speak of, what is the significance of us human beings in this universe. So the Bible contains many different kinds of literature, some of which is written as historical narrative. A lot of it is poetry, wisdom sayings, all kinds of, different literary genres. So you need to identify what is the literary genre and then interpret accordingly. And this is where, again, sometimes the scientific evidence, scientific theories can also guide us in challenging the church's accepted understanding of a genre and say, well, no, maybe we shouldn't take it literally when the psalmist says the earth can never be moved. He's using poetic, figurative language because the earth is in motion. So this is where the sciences can help often in the interpretation. But in most cases, the clues to interpretation are given by identifying the kind of literature this particular text is.
Comment, or should
Well,
we move on?
Well, just briefly, that to me it seems kind of like moving the goalpost. I mean, you can always say that, well, at some point we believe X to be true, and then later when we learn that it's not the case, we can always say, well, it's not supposed to be read like that. We have to rethink how we interpret the Bible. I think it just proves, or at least indicates very strongly to me that it's just a book written by people, and there's nothing special about it, and it's wrong in so many ways. And you mentioned, for instance, the creation story, that you shouldn't take the days literally. That's fine, but still the order of things, the way it's described, doesn't match at all with what we know about how the world came about. So why even if it's just a poetic description of it, why do it all wrong? Why don't at least match it somehow correctly to what happened?
Well, I said earlier that a scientist starts with a position of humility, of saying, I don't know, I can't reason from first principles. Let's listen to what nature tells us about its nature. In the same way, I think you need the humility to approach this text and listen to what the authors, who live in a very different world to our world, who are not raising questions that you and I may be raising as scientists. Listen to the questions that they are wrestling with. That's basic intellectual humility. Obviously, chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Genesis contradict each other. They are two separate creation accounts. So then give the writer the benefit of the doubt and say, well, he's obviously not a fool. If these two accounts contradict each other, maybe he's looking at something from two different perspectives and trying to bring out two different truths, but write them in the language that he's familiar with, which is not a scientific language. But just because something is not scientific does not mean that it cannot be true.
All right. Next question.
Hello, my name is Trine. I'm not a scientist. I am an atheist. So now you know where I come from. I work with words daily, and I must say that once again, I'm shocked at the arrogance of people of faith. I'm shocked at the language that religious people, philosophically minded people, are higher or deeper. I'm shocked at the simple linguistic, arrogance is the word, that is always used in these matters. So when I pose my question, and there is a question for both of you, I'd really appreciate if the words high or deep did not appear in the answer. My question is, in fact, back to the point of the whole debate. How does your worldview carry on into the lab? How does your Christianity, your religious feelings, color your work? And to Stinus, it would be exactly the opposite. Do you ever stand in the lab and say, I really need another explanation? Thank you.
Well, it's very interesting that the question of arrogance, if you read the reviews of Richard Dawkins' last book, and also writers like Christopher Hitchens, these are secular reviewers. They're not Christians or Jews or Muslims, but a lot of the reviews are deeply embarrassed by the arrogance with which these writers write about philosophical and theological matters that they have not even begun to explore. The childish views of God and what Christians or Muslims believe, and yet are ridiculed in a very high-handed, arrogant way. So I'm very interested that you should accuse people of what you call people of faith of arrogance, because the popularizers of science use their status in the sort of global market to actually misrepresent, distort, and demean and degrade people of faith in ways that they often cannot answer back. You ask me, how does your worldview shape what you do in the laboratory? Well, actually, I'm not working anymore in engineering research. I gave that up some time ago for other reasons. But I said at the beginning, the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge has Psalm 111, verse 1 as its text. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who take delight in them. Love for God implies a love for what God has created and is creating. And so when you love God's world, and you're exploring the beauty and the truth and the wonder of God's world, whether you're studying human anatomy or whether you're studying plant physiology or whether you're studying nuclear physics.
Well, I've always been what you would call a scientific thinking person or critically thinking person, and my atheism, or that I found out that I should call myself an atheist, was something I just, happened naturally, and it doesn't color my work in the lab in any way. Well, I'm not really a lab person. I'm more like a computer science person, but still. So it's not like I go into what I'm doing research on and want to disprove God or anything like that. It's just, go wherever the evidence leads. And so far I haven't seen any evidence for supernatural things in what I'm doing.
Yes, next question.
Yeah, I partly got my answer, well, some of my answers in the question that was posed just now, but it's mainly to Stinus. You said at some point that you wanted us to leave the worldview at the lab door. Do you really think that is possible? Isn't our worldview in the broadest sense what creates the framework and the theoretical framework that we all use when we view and analyze data in whatever field we are with? Or maybe phrased differently, do you believe that it is possible to be completely, objective without being affected by any worldview, that being atheist or theistic? Because that was what I heard you wanting to do,
Well, ideally we would like to do that, of course, but you are, of course, a human being and you have values and you want to. Normally people would very much like to prove that whatever they're working on is true or whatever they're doing is fantastic. That's why we have a peer review process. That's why we have this whole setup that is going to weed out hopefully all the subjective things that enter into the science, so we can end up having the objective result in the end. So that's how we can try to avoid that. What I meant is simply that you cannot do, I think, good science if you go into the lab thinking that God created whatever you're looking at. You want to somehow find evidence for that. I'm not saying that it's possible to leave whatever your values or your belief systems. I don't think it's really possible to leave all that behind, of course.
But isn't it the same way that you are then not able to leave out that you're... Sure. I mean, it comes up very, very clearly in the discussion here that you are on two different places, and you as much are not able to leave that as...
Well, the good thing is that I rely on naturalistic causes to explain what I'm doing, and that's kind of the concept of science.
But isn't that in some way a theoretical framework in the same way as whatever you are...
That's science. It's hard to do science if you are able to invoke supernatural causes to explain whatever you're looking at. Then you can explain anything or basically nothing in the end, if you can just do that. We want to explain things based on things we can actually observe, on evidence, on naturalistic causes.
I'm not just talking about... Okay, I'll leave that for later.
Right. Vinoth, any comments?
Yes, I still feel that Stinus here is really destroying straw men, the god of the gaps, when you talk of supernatural causes. I don't know any responsible Christian scientists. You mentioned Francis Collins, for example. I don't think any of them bring supernatural causes into their laboratory work.
I didn't say so.
Yeah, but I can think of many atheists who have used their atheism to resist what we now know to be scientifically true theories. Fred Hoyle is the most famous one. He's the one who coined the term Big Bang cosmology as a term of ridicule because he believed in a steady-state universe for atheistic reasons. And the Big Bang sort of theory that the universe had an origin in time, a singularity in space and time, actually that solution to Einstein's equations was discovered by a Roman Catholic priest, George Lemaître. And because it came from a Roman Catholic priest, Fred Hoyle thought, all this talk of singularity and an origin in time to the universe, so the universe is not eternal, but it actually had a beginning. This smacks of Christian theology, and so he ridiculed it and refused to believe it right throughout his life. And he was perhaps one of the, the most famous cosmologists of the mid-20th century. And his collaborator in his research was a Sri Lankan Buddhist, Chandra Wickramasinghe, who on Buddhist grounds, also refused to believe that there was a temporal beginning to the universe, and so opposed what today we call Big Bang cosmology. If you go back to the 19th century, the father of genetics, Mendel, was an Augustinian monk, and he was a German. And Darwin's followers in Germany interpreted Darwin's theory materialistically, atheistically. So they suppressed Mendel's pioneering work in genetics, because they had these other material explanations, things called gemmules or whatever that they speculated about. And it was in the 1930s that another Christian statistician by the name of Lord Fisher in England gave a mathematical grounding to the science of genetics. And so you have two prominent Christians, Mendel in 1880s, Fisher in England in the 1930s, who are at the foundation of modern genetics and the neo-Darwinian synthesis. And you have atheists in Germany who are ardent followers of Darwin but insist on interpreting evolution only as an atheistic, anti-Christian sort of ideology, who suppress the rise of genetics. So we only read in the popular science books about how these die-hard, fanatical, religious extremists have been obstacles in the progress of science. But the story is more complicated. There were many atheists who have been obstacles in the progress of science, many atheists who also opposed Darwinian ideas in the 19th century and so on. So that's why I keep saying, please go back and read the real historians of science and the real philosophers of science, and not the popularizers like Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, and people like that.
Yeah, but I still think that's irrelevant to the point that you have to rely on naturalistic causes. I mean, sure, you can find stupid people who are atheists, just as you can find stupid people who are believers in any religion. That doesn't prove or disprove anything. The point is that you have to rely on naturalistic causes. That was, as I understood the question here. Yes, and as I said, no, I don't think it's completely possible. That's why we have the peer review process, to try and weed out all the subjective things that might enter into research.
All right.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
That if enough people look at it, it's possible to be objective, as long as you've got peer review on it.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, I think the process is flawed.
I don't agree with you, but...
yeah, I disagree. I think that whole process is flawed. I mentioned the whole theory of multiverses, parallel universes. Speculations about these things are carried on in prestigious scientific journals. But if somebody, say, speculates about intelligent design, it's ruled out as a religious speculation. Now, I don't believe in intelligent design, but still, if you're going to accept philosophical speculations about other universes, multiverses, and so on, which is non-scientific, then you must also be willing to accept arguments about intelligent design and the first cause of the Big Bang and all that. They're the same level.
Do you have a final comment on the specific question asked?
Well, just that this shouldn't be a debate about the peer review process. There are many problems with the peer review process, and I'm not saying that we can always obtain pure objective knowledge. That's not my point. I'm just saying that the peer review process can help us weed out errors, hopefully, that accumulate from random noises, random people's different worldviews. And in some cases, yes, we can reach objective scientific knowledge, but not necessarily always.
All right, thank you. Next question.
I'm not a scientist myself, just a curious mind. And I happened to read quite a few articles which all claim in their sphere, if the magnetic field just would change a little bit, that will have a dramatic impact. And if the Earth trajectory would just derail by 2%, we'll all be covered in ice, and so forth and so forth. And that sounds like a whole line of lucky coincidences for us to be here. And my question kind of is in two parts. One would be, can we then say that all these coincidences are just like winning in a lottery every single Sunday for the next 10 years? And if so, isn't it believing in that just as much a leap of faith than in anything else?
Well, this is what we mentioned earlier, what goes as the cosmological anthropic principle, that it seems, especially when it comes to the laws of nature and six fundamental numbers in physics, are so finely tuned in terms of their accuracy. For example, there is one number which goes by the Greek symbol lambda, which is roughly a measure of the long-range acceleration of the universe. Now, Einstein, in his equations, actually he later regretted it. He felt that he ought to put fix lambda as 0. The actual value of lambda is 10 to the power of minus 120. Now, if you know maths, you know that 10 to the power of minus 120 is infinitesimally tiny, 120 zeros, okay? And yet it's not 0. If it was 0, there would be no acceleration. There would be no what today we call dark energy, which makes up a large percentage of the universe. We don't quite know what this dark energy is. So that's an example of just how finely, accurately tuned the universe is, that if there wasn't acceleration, if there weren't these finely tuned constants, the universe would simply have collapsed on itself. Second-generation stars, which produce carbon and oxygen, which are necessary for life, would not have come into being. We wouldn't have a solar system. We wouldn't have an Earth. There wouldn't be intelligent life on Earth. So you can't demonstrate scientifically that obviously this is an argument that there was a supreme intelligence who from the beginning had framed the universe in such a way that over a long process of time, the universe would unfold towards the emergence of conscious life. You can't demonstrate that from within science. But given grounds, as I have been arguing, for belief in a supreme ultimate creator, it makes sense. It is plausible. So a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim has no problem with the cosmological anthropic principle. The people who do have a problem are the hardcore atheists. And so far, the only way that they can try to get around the implications of the anthropic principle is by speculating about there being an infinite number of universes and that we just happen to be the ones in which intelligent life forms emerge because in our universe, those constants had the values that they actually have. But in other universes where those six numbers, those six constants have different values, there would be no life forms as we have it today. So that would be an atheistic way of trying to evade the implications of the cosmological anthropic principle.
So just to answer as an atheist, I would say that the anthropic principle, I have no problem with that. It's obviously true that we live in a universe that supports life. But as I also said earlier, and let's just do this briefly, I think it's turning the things upside down, that if these things were different, obviously we wouldn't be here to observe it. So it's not a surprise to me that when we measure the constants of the universe, we find constants that support life. I think it's kind of obvious, really.
Right. Next question.
Hi. First of all, thanks to both of you for being here today and enlightening us. Secondly, I think atheism and theism are each other's extremes, and I've come across, when I discussed the issue of God with both atheists and theists, that one claims intellectual honesty for themselves, and the others claim this patent on the nature of God and the concept of God, how he or she is to be understood, and how he or she manifests himself in the universe. And I think a lot of the misconceptions can be cleared up if you, first of all, if you define what you mean by God. Like if you create a definition for God, because you have people, monistic idealists, proponents for this this ideology, if you will, such as Amit Goswami, who's a scientist himself. They try to build a bridge between these supposedly two conflicting understandings of the world by saying that you have consciousness, and you were earlier you spoke of this gentleman in the gray, and in fact that consciousness is the ground of being, and in fact this is God. And earlier, the gentleman in gray, you also said that God is contained in the universe. In other words, God is a part of himself. I'm not sure if you follow my lead here, but
what your question is? My
question is, how would you define God? How would you define God? Because you said that God is a part of...
There are many things that I cannot define, and the more important they are, the less I'm able to define them. But I would say God is not this. And so when somebody says he's an atheist, I say, well, tell me about this God whom you don't believe in. And in most cases, I find I don't believe in that God either. I've said I don't believe in this God of the gaps, a God whom you invoke to explain something that contemporary science has no answer to, or that the moment that science has closed the gap, then you don't need God. God is not involved in that process or whatever. God is just impersonal consciousness or energy. No. The early Christians were called atheists, remember, because they refused to believe in the traditional gods of Rome. They believed to worship the emperor as divine. Like I said, they believed that God is known through a crucified state criminal, which was a revolutionary, radical, absurd, foolish thing to say. And yet it was a message that ultimately subverted the empire, overturned the empire. So if you want to know what God is, I don't give definitions. Okay. I would say actually look at a person, Jesus of Nazareth.
Okay, but at the same time you say that God is contained in the universe.
No, I'm saying the way that God, the language of God is used in theistic traditions is that God is not a being, but God is that which gives being its being. God is one who allows us, lets us to be, sustains us in being.
In other words, a separate creator?
Yes, a creator. So to create, just as say Beethoven, when he composes the Ninth Symphony, where did the Ninth Symphony begin? Nowhere. He creates it out of nothingness. Okay. He imagines it into being, but once it comes into being, he engages with it. He enacts it. He interacts with it. You know, it's like that. That's the language of creation, whether we in human creation or divine creation. And so we are all, in a sense, like those Beethoven's Ninth Symphonies. We are acts of creation, but we are flawed creations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question, yes.
Chantal Lynge, jeg er fra Københavns Universitet, blandt andet. For det første, jeg undrer mig over... Sorry, I have to speak in English. I'm French, so, you know, I have to jungle with the languages. Yes, at first, I must say I'm very surprised about your argumentation about your Christianity. Because you lack of science in it, in the ways, and you are speaking about the Psalms and the history of Christianity in a way which is wrong, actually. But we can let it for what it is. One of the reason I wanted to ask you something, it's because I'm always very amazed when I see the human brain, when you have a primitive brain and the other brain with the lapse, on the frontal lapse. And that brain has developed. And you speak with your Christianity as your final product. You don't know how mankind will be in 2 million of years, how our brain will look like. So it's funny to see that in spite of you are a scientist, you make humankind as a final product, which is static actually. When atheists are taking more a point of view from outside. You say in your argumentation you didn't mean that a human being was at the center of the creation, yet you speak like that anyway. And it's for that I've thought about that question: how will develop the human brain and the human being in the future? Because what you think, which is maybe right today, will not be necessarily right tomorrow.
Thank you. Sure. But I mean, I believe in the uniqueness of the human simply because I believe that God himself has taken into himself human life in a way that God has not taken the life of an amoeba or even a dolphin. Now, that doesn't mean that the amoeba and the dolphin are not valuable to God. They are. But we human beings matter to God in a way that is different to other forms of life. And that is why I say that human life is intrinsically valuable and worth. That does not mean that everything else exists for the human. Everything else exists for God, including the human. But human beings have a special responsibility before God for the way that we treat other creatures, and other creatures are not responsible to God for the way that they treat us in the same way. So nature is indifferent to what happens to us human beings. Why should we care about the human future? You know, if human beings die out tomorrow, the earth will throw up new life forms that can survive, say, at higher global temperatures.
Yes, but with another God?
Pardon?
But with another God?
Well, I don't know. That assumes that you think God is a human invention. Then when human beings evolve, God will evolve. But if God is not a human invention, if God is, as I have been speaking of God this evening, and please at least entertain that possibility. If you entertain that possibility, then your assumptions are false.
So is your question whether, say, in 2 million years, if we look on Earth, human beings will look like we do today, and if we don't look like we do today, is that because the image of God has changed, or is it because we just made up God? I mean, is that your...
That's so.
Yeah, okay. I would be surprised if humans as we know them would be here in 2 million years. Isn't 2 million years around the average lifespan of any species? I'm looking at you people, so something like that.
It's actually, Neanderthal man is over, I mean, and he believes maybe in something also. Yeah.
Well, I think what happens to the human race depends on us and not on evolution anymore. That once human beings come into existence, it's what we call cultural evolution that takes over from the merely biological.
I think that's wrong. I mean, we can see in some populations we have even accelerated evolution because we are able to mate across borders that we weren't able to do earlier. I mean, evolution hasn't stopped. I know I forgot his name, but some scientists said that a few years ago, saying that evolution of humans had stopped. I don't think that's legitimate at all.
No, I think we interact with evolution through our technology in ways that have changed the whole scenario.
Yeah, it doesn't negate evolution, though.
All right, we have 10 more minutes, and we have 3 in line, so please keep the questions and answers short.
Okay. I was once presented with an argument for the theistic worldview that I would like to present to you guys. And the argument involves around the human needs that all have an entity to meet them. For instance, we are all feeling thirst, and to meet that need we have water. We are all feeling the need of, or the drive of hunger, and we all have food to meet it. We all feel the drive of sex, and we have reproduction to meet it. And in the same way, we all have the drive to seek meaning. And if that is the case, I would like to ask you if you think that that places a challenge to the naturalist in terms of putting human beings in the same category as the rest of the animal kingdom.
I don't see why. I mean, so you're asking whether it makes humans special because we also have a need for understanding the world around us?
Well, yeah, we all have the drive to seek meaning,
yeah,
and in terms of everything, all the other needs we have an entity to meet them.
Oh, so there has to be a meaning. Is that what you're getting at? I see. No, I don't see. I mean, I don't seek meaning. I seek to understand why the world functions the way it does, and I don't see any purpose. I mean, speaking globally, any purpose with life. I mean, the purpose for my life is, of course, to feel happy, as a good Darwinist, to reproduce. I mean, that's what I want to do. I don't seek what people normally understand by meaning in the world today.
Well, I mean, if you look around the world, almost all culture has come up with some sort of religion.
We want to understand the world around us. We need to understand why things happen the way they do. And I think that's, at least, I mean, I don't want to simplify anything. I mean, religion is complicated as well. But that's at least one reason, I think, that why we have religions. It's a way of understanding and trying to explain the world around us, just as science is, I would argue, a much better, though, way of understanding the world around us. We want to understand it because we are a curious species. But I don't see a problem for naturalism just because we are interested in understanding the world around us.
Well, I can rephrase his question, perhaps. He's saying, if we have desires within us, and there are things outside of us that actually meet those desires, if one such desire is a desire for transcendence, for meaning, for purpose or whatever, why is it then the atheist then denies that and says there is no objective reality out there that actually meets that desire and makes sense of that desire?
I still don't see an argument for
isn't that your question?
Yes, that was right.
Yeah, and I agree with that question. It's like this: we are purpose-driven, meaning seekers, truth-oriented human beings. And how do we account then for ourselves as human beings within a worldview that denies any objective purpose or meaning or truth beyond human construction?
I guess it's just because I'm not a theist, but I really don't see the problem at all. I mean, I pursue understanding the world through science, and I don't see a problem with that. I don't expect to find a higher meaning with it. I don't expect that. I don't have the drive for that. So I guess that's why I don't see a problem with it. I mean, I could imagine there are many things you could want out of life. It doesn't mean that they necessarily exist just because you want them to exist.
Well, everything else that we do desire, there is something in life that does meet that desire.
Sure, I mean,
so why do we deny? No, we're not talking about science. He's talking about, Well, he's challenging your naturalist.
I'm just saying that I don't have an urge to find a meaning in life. So obviously it doesn't apply to me. So therefore the argument is kind of void. I don't have a need to explain a meaning with my life as such. I don't see a problem at all.
Well, people who don't have any meaning for existence end up committing suicide.
Well, I hope you're wrong. I mean, I could say that
people create some meaning for their life.
Obviously, you want a meaning in life, so therefore you create your God to meet that need.
Exactly.
I don't have the need to have a specific meaning with my life, so I don't make up a God to meet that need because I don't need that. I mean, it's just, I think it's kind of arrogant to assume that just because you want that, then everybody else must do that too.
I'm saying some people find meaning in their religion, others in their close relationships, in family,
I think
in
it depends
work.
a lot on what you mean by meaning.
Yes, meaning a reason for existence, a reason for continuing to live, a reason that's to get up in the morning.
That's exactly what I said.
Right?
I have the reason to live, which is to be as happy as possible, to procreate, to live my life as I want to, and that's what I'm doing. And I don't need a God to to explain that
But
at
the
all.
fact is that all cultures have been created in the West or the East or wherever because people have not been content with just individual happiness and material comfort as sources of meaning. And that is why they create art and literature and music and ceremonies and rituals and religious worship and all this. And if the gods are removed, then something else takes the place of those gods.
I agree completely, and I still don't see a problem because I also appreciate books or movies or music or going to the theater. And I don't need a God to explain why I enjoy those things.
But all the great music, all the great books, all the great movies do raise questions about meaning, about truth, about purpose to human life or whatever. That's what makes the great literatures of the world.
Yeah, and still, I mean, it doesn't.
So that is what we mean when the
follow. Therefore, God must exist. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
So that is what we mean by the human condition. It's not just the human being who gets up, eats, sleeps, fornicates. That's not human.
No.
The human is
of
found.
Course. Part of being happy is, of course, to do those things like read, like go to the movies, like listen to music.
And all the great cultures of the world that have produced the great music and literature and all have some kind of transcendental, spiritual, religious, whatever word you use, a core to them, an engine that has driven them. And that is what is behind this man's question, that there has been a thirst for meaning and purpose that takes people outside of themselves and puts them in touch with some kind of cosmic transcendent order, whatever you want to call it, whether God or whatever. And that has been the engine for cultural development. And all the great civilizations and cultures of the world have that transcendent core.
Yeah, but I don't think religions cannot hijack these feelings or this transcendent need to.
His question is that calls for explanation, and you're evading the explanation.
I'm just saying that I still don't see a problem at all. I mean, I don't see why it should logically follow from that therefore there must be a God, or in your case, the Christian God. I don't see that connection at all. I think it's
okay. We have 10 minutes left and 2 more questions to go. Okay. So, second to last question.
Yes, my name is Mads Jensen, and I'm a student. I'm studying math and economics. And my question is primarily for Vinoth, but both of you could answer. I read Genesis the way that I actually think it also describes how God created the world, which means that I do not believe in evolution. Maybe you would probably say that it would make me a bad text interpreter, but would you also say it would make me a bad scientist?
Yes, I think it will make you a bad scientist. But I think you're abusing Scripture because, I mean, you must respect the integrity of Scripture and not read into Scripture questions that the biblical writers are not asking or addressing. But there are so many books written on this. I mean, so many biblical commentaries on Genesis you can look up. My last book, which was mentioned, Subverting Global Myths, I have a chapter called Myths About Science, where I expand on some of the things I've been saying this evening, but also saying why evolution is not the opposite or a contradiction of the Christian doctrine of creation. So I would suggest you read that.
Thank you. Right. And you will probably say the same, yes?
Yeah, more or less shorter, but still, yeah. And no, I haven't written a book about it. I'm just happy you're not in biology, though. Not surprised, though, but, I mean, most people who deny evolution are either physicists or engineers. No offense, but or dentists.
Well, I'm a Christian, and I'm not.
Lower the mic a little.
Yeah, I'm not that tall. I'm a Christian, and I'm not a scientist, so I feel a bit limited in my way of asking the question because it may not sound as complicated as you would wish. But my point is that I both think, going back to the beginning, that you both have taken a choice of faith. And the atheist, I wonder why chooses to become an atheist and decline an openness for example, miracles or the unexplainable. You called it gaps earlier on. I'm just curious why you make this choice instead of saying, I don't know. Personally, I have said that for many years, I don't know. And I don't want to be a Christian because there's so many religions and it doesn't make sense. It's just crazy. But the Bible does say if we define God as the Christian God, because that would make the discussion easier from the very beginning, which God we're talking about. I have made a choice, a leap of faith. You know, I decide, and without faith, there's no doubt. So in that sense, I think you're both believers, but you've taken different beliefs. And to conclude, even the Bible says that it makes no sense to try to argue for faith logically. So it's an impossible discussion to start off with, to some extent. But it makes us wiser, and it makes it easier to understand what we believe.
And the question is?
I already asked both people questions
Right.
while I was speaking. The first one for the atheist,
Yes.
why have you made that choice? Don't you think it's a choice, and don't you think you are forced to ignore the unknown to some extent, like, for instance, miracles, or something else you can't explain? It's just a really radical choice to say, I'm an atheist. And for the believer, the same question, just the other way. How can you, as a scientist, not doubt your own faith and say, like, I'm a Christian and, this is like my firm belief? So it's the same question for both of you. Why do you believe what you believe?
So I've never been a believer. When I grew up, religion wasn't part of my family at all. We didn't even go to church on Christmas Eve, and it's not like we discussed religion at all. Didn't play a role at all. So it's kind of obvious for me that since I haven't been force-fed religion since I was a child, I'm just not thinking that way. And I would say I never claimed to understand everything and being able to explain everything at all. I would say that I haven't seen evidence to believe in any of the gods that people can believe in, including your God. Or, you say the Christian God like it's a well-defined thing. I don't think that's the case. I've debated with many Christians who had very different understandings of what God is. So I don't think it's that clear-cut. But so I'm an atheist because I have no good reasons to not be an atheist. I haven't seen any good reasons to believe in anything, and I haven't seen what you call a miracle. We have many things we're not able to explain yet, but none of them defies what you would expect from nature, defies the laws of nature, whatever you want to call it. I haven't seen any evidence for that. I haven't seen evidence for people getting up from being dead, or partings of seas, or anything like that. So I haven't met any miracles that need... if I did that, if at some point I actually observed something that could only be explained by some supernatural intervention, then of course I had to revise my worldview. It doesn't necessarily follow then that I would become a Christian. I would have to find out which of the many, many weird things could explain this, and I have to weed out all the more sensible, naturalistic causes first. That's the way I think you should approach every question. You can observe something in the sky that you don't know what it is. It doesn't necessarily follow that therefore it must be a spaceship from another planet. It could be a billion other things, and you have to rule out them before you conclude that it's something extraordinarily unlikely.
To say I totally respect that opinion or way of thinking.
Any comments? All right. I think that concludes the debate then. In another setting, I might have said thank God for both of you. I should not say that tonight, but just say thank you for enlightening us.